The rain on Nexus 9 did not fall from clouds. It drifted in waves of iridescent mist, carried by solar winds across the upper atmosphere and dripping down like liquid glass. Each droplet that touched the ground sang a note, soft and distant, as if the planet itself remembered the music of what it used to be. Commander Cale Thorne adjusted the collar of his dark coat as the security gate hissed open before him. Behind it stretched a narrow corridor flanked by reinforced glass and humming energy rails. Light panels flickered overhead with a sterile glow, but it was not the machinery that made the air heavy. It was the silence, not peaceful silence, held silence, as if something massive were breathing just out of view, slow and patient. "You sure you want to see it alone?" the warden asked, voice a whisper despite the steel in his tone. "Most don't last more than a minute." Cale didn't answer. He stepped forward, past another gate, then another, until he saw her. The cell was enormous, almost the size of a cargo bay. The walls were lined with null energy bands, their shifting patterns rippling like oil in water. And in the center, half shadowed by the dim light, knelt a creature the galaxy called Valari. She was not chained in the traditional sense. Her wrists were bound in floating coils of harmonic restraint, each loop pulsing in time with her heartbeat. Her ankles, too. But it was her stillness that disturbed him most. Not fear, not rage, stillness. Her skin shimmered with shades of violet and midnight, glowing faintly like mineral veins under the surface of a canyon. Her hair was a fall of silver and dusk, cascading over broad shoulders. Etchings moved slowly across her arms and the collarbones, twin tattoos alive with ancient light, shifting shape every few moments like language forgotten by time. She was tall, at least 8 meters, a being made for different gravity, different laws, a titan. And she was watching him. Eyes that held no whites, only swirling galaxies of pale blue, locked with his. Cole stepped closer, until he stood directly in front of the glass. Valari did not flinch. He could hear his own breath, slow and tight in his chest. He raised a hand, just slightly, and then, impossibly, so did she. Their palms met on opposite sides of the reinforced glass. No sound, no movement, just that single moment. Skin to skin, separated by a pain no thicker than protocol and fear. Kyle whispered, "I'm not here to fear you." Her voice, deep and strangely melodic, slipped into his mind, not spoken but felt. "Then why are you here, little human?" He hesitated, then said with a quiet certainty that surprised even him, "To remember what everyone else forgot. That you were never a monster." A long pause. Then her expression shifted, and for the first time in years she smiled. The next morning the security logs showed an anomaly. Commander Cale Thorne had requested a second visit, voluntarily. No guards, no cameras, just him. The request raised eyebrows, but no one dared stop him. He returned to the vault where Valari was kept. This time, he carried nothing. No datapad, no weapons, no questions. Only presence. The doors opened with a hiss. Inside, the light had shifted. The null energy coils pulsed slower now, almost in time with the rhythm of the planet. Valari sat in the same position, but her head turned as soon as he entered. Her gaze, galactic and ancient, met his once again. "You came back," she said aloud this time, her voice a low chime that felt like a forgotten hymn. Cole approached the glass without hesitation. "I said I would." She tilted her head. "You are the first who has spoken to me twice. Most stare, then they leave, or they curse. Some throw objects, one cried." Kyle studied her face. "Do you want to be spoken to?" Valari was quiet. Then she nodded once. "Yes, Even monsters crave voices that do not tremble. He sat down on the cold floor, arms resting over his knees. I'm not afraid of you. Then you are either brave, she said, or broken. Cole smiled faintly. Maybe both. They fell into a rhythm, not of conversation but of quiet exchange. He spoke of Earth, not the military bases or capital cities but the forgotten places, rivers in autumn, wildflowers after rain, the hum of crickets in twilight. She listened, unmoving. Then slowly, she began to respond. Valari spoke of Titanus Prime, their ancient moon city carved from sapphire stone, their rituals of light, the songs they sang to the sky. How her kind once walked beside the stars until they were hunted, labeled, broken. When I fell, she said, I was the last. Cole looked up. The last Titan? She nodded. He exhaled. You must carry so much. I did, she whispered, until now. He leaned forward slightly. Why now? Valari met his eyes again, and for the first time her voice wavered. Because someone returned, not to study, not to tame, but to stay. Kyle said nothing. He didn't have to. Her hand moved slowly, fingers outstretched. He raised his own, placing it once more against the glass. There was no magic in it, just warmth, just choice. In that moment, the tattoos on her arm shimmered gold. I've not spoken my name aloud in many rotations, she said. He waited. My name, she said slowly, is Valari, daughter of the Starborn Flame, keeper of the last gate. Coil whispered, I'm honored, Valari. And for the first time she responded in kind. Kyle, she said gently, tasting the sound. Your name fits inside me, like light in a cavern. They stayed there, two worlds breathing on opposite sides of the same memory, and the world outside, blind and humming, kept turning. Time blurred inside the Titan's vault. Cale Thorne returned daily now, each visit longer than the last. No one stopped him. The guards had stopped asking. The scientists had stopped recording. And the warden, though suspicious, said nothing, because protocol had no page for what was happening here. And what was happening could not be measured by cameras or biometric scans. It lived in the space between silences. Coil entered quietly, as always, but this time something was different. Valari was standing, not crouched or kneeling, but tall, towering, radiant in stillness. He paused just inside the entrance, unsure whether to speak. You do not fear my height today, she said, voice echoing gently in the chamber. I never did, Cole replied. But I had to earn the right to see it. A slow smile touched her lips, faint but real. She walked toward the glass, steps slow and fluid. The living tattoos across her body shimmered a deep violet, shifting in elegant swirls. Carl noticed something new, an arc of golden light tracing her left shoulder, pulsing in time with her breath. That mark, he said softly. It's new. It awakened yesterday, Valari replied. In our language, it means trust offered. Coil stepped closer. You trust me. I do, she said. So now, I will show you the thing you came for, the truth. She raised both arms and the air around her shifted. A soft resonance hummed, vibrating in the walls. The lights dimmed. Behind her, a panel of crystal slowly opened, revealing something hidden, a containment engine. Small, complex, humming with low energy pulses. Inside it, the true restraints. Not metal, not force. Resonance inhibitors. You were not just caged by walls, Cole whispered. They silenced your soul. Valari nodded. These bind not the body but the essence. I am not weak. I was silenced. Kyle stared at the engine. I can disable this. No, Valari said, voice firm. Not yet. First, I need something. I have never known. He looked at her. What? She stepped closer to the glass. Her eyes softened, glowing faint blue. I need a touch that is not violence, a gesture without fear. Cole didn't hesitate. He reached for the interface panel and entered the override code he'd memorized from stolen schematics. The null glass shimmered, then faded. The barrier vanished. Alarms did not sound, because no one ever expected this. He stepped through. Now, there was nothing between them, only breath, only space. Valari knelt, not in submission, but so they could meet eye to eye. Her skin shimmered faintly, heat radiating in waves. Kyle slowly reached out, palm up. She watched his hand for a long time, then she lifted hers and placed it in his. Her hand was massive, elegant, covered in smooth skin traced by glowing lines. Cole closed his fingers gently around two of hers. "Not afraid?" she asked. "No," he said, "but I think I was always meant to touch you." For a moment, neither moved. Then something extraordinary happened. The tattoos across her arm burst into full light, glowing gold and silver. Symbols danced. And then, for the first time in her long imprisoned existence, Valari wept. Not with sorrow, but with relief. Because someone had finally dared to touch her, not to chain her, not to wound her, but to understand. The air in the upper corridors of Nexus 9 felt sharper than usual. Cold, too quiet. The kind of silence that crawled under the skin before danger struck. Cale Thorne moved fast through the maintenance shafts, heart pounding not from fear, but from clarity. He had a plan now. He had coordinates, access codes, and a tight window. In exactly 16 minutes, the station's internal power grid would enter its scheduled calibration phase. For 90 seconds, the energy suppression field in Valari's vault would flicker. That was their moment. He had memorized every detail, but what he hadn't prepared for was betrayal. As he rounded the corner toward the junction, two security officers were already waiting. "We know where you've been, Commander," one of them said, lifting his rifle. Cole didn't stop moving. "Step aside." "We can't," the other said, his voice less certain. "You're compromising containment protocol." Cole drew his pulse blade, not to threaten, but to warn. "She's not a threat, you're just afraid of something you never tried to understand." Before either could respond, a siren screamed through the corridor. Not a security alarm, not a containment breach, something worse. A manual lockdown from the central command deck. Someone had found the override sequence. Someone who knew what Cale was planning. Director Van Cale's eyes narrowed. He knew then what had happened. Someone had leaked his access to the vault. He didn't know if it was an algorithm or a person, but it didn't matter. The enemy wasn't just fear anymore, it was systemized cruelty. He turned and ran, back toward her. Inside the vault, Valari stirred. The chains around her flickered, weakened for a moment as the calibration sequence began, but they did not fall away. She sensed something, pain, panic. Kyle's voice reached her through the inner corridor. "Valari, they know." She stood, every muscle in her massive body tensing. "Then we move now." Kyle skidded into the chamber, breath ragged. "They're sealing the levels, we don't have time." She reached down, eyes glowing. Then break time. And she did. Her hands surged with raw resonance. Kyle saw the tattoos flare white, burning like molten circuits across her skin. She lifted her arms and ripped the restraints apart with a scream that split the walls. The room trembled. Alarms shrieked. The containment core shattered behind her, its internal nodes flashing in death. Cole shielded his eyes as the light swelled. When he looked again, she was free, and she was beautiful in the way a sunrise over a battlefield is beautiful, terrifying and undeniable. "I cannot walk through walls," she said calmly, "but I can erase them." She reached down, lifted Cole in her arms like he weighed nothing, and charged. Walls bent, doors crumpled, men fired, but the bullets melted before they struck her skin. She didn't retaliate, she only ran. Forward, through steel, through hate, through the machine built to cage her. Cole held on as sparks flew, sirens wailed, and smoke poured in behind them. Somewhere ahead, there was air, light, freedom, and they would reach it. Together. The sky above Nexus 9 was not blue or black. It was an endless dome of mirrored storm, reflecting the chaos below in slow, rippling waves. As Valari burst through the final barrier of the inner compound, carrying Cale Thorne in her arms, the heavens themselves seemed to ripple with disbelief. They were out, they had done the unthinkable. She stopped on a ridge of fused obsidian overlooking the valley basin. Behind them, the compound crackled with smoke and alarms, flashing red across the sky like blood in water. Drones buzzed above, searching but hesitating. No protocol existed for a Titan on the move. Valari exhaled, long, slow, seismic. Her muscles flexed beneath skin that glowed faint lavender. The shifting tattoos across her collarbones now swirled with deep silver and soft gold. Alive, alert. Cole climbed down from her arm, boots sinking into mossy stone. "You're faster than any dropship I've ridden," he said, catching his breath. Valari smirked. "I carried the wind once." It remembered. Cole looked up at her, chest rising and falling. "How long before they send the gunships?" "Not long," she replied. "But we're not staying." He pointed toward a dark break in the horizon, the Whispering Chasm. An ancient gorge said to be filled with subterranean echo mines from the old Titan Age. "We can hide there. I've mapped a tunnel system. It leads to the outer ridge." She nodded and followed him, her footsteps shaking the ground in a way that felt like drum beats calling something ancient awake. Inside the chasm, silence fell heavy. It was a silence filled with breath and unspoken truth. They moved carefully, lighting the tunnels with a dim field lamp. Cole led the way through twisted rock formations while Valari stayed close, occasionally touching the wall with her palm. When she did, the stone glowed faintly beneath her fingers, as if recognizing her. "You were here once," Cale said, watching. She nodded. "I was born not far from this gorge. My people walked these tunnels long before your kind arrived." They stopped in a hollowed chamber lined with veins of glowing crystal. Safe. For now. Cole knelt to unpack rations, but paused when he saw Valari lean against the wall, one hand on her abdomen, brows furrowed. Not in pain, but in concentration. "What is it?" he asked, rising. She looked at him, eyes softer than he had ever seen. "My body," she said quietly. "It responds differently now." He moved closer. "Are you hurt?" "No," she whispered. "It is not injury, it is creation." Cole froze. "You mean—" "Yes," she said, voice barely audible. "I am carrying something, a hybrid spark, a fusion of resonance and blood, of Titan and man." Cole sat slowly, staring at her. "How?" he breathed. She gave a small, tired smile. "Do you remember the first time you touched my hand? Resonance does not obey biology, it obeys bond. Our connection, deep enough, brave enough, opened the gate." Cole reached for her hand again, gently. She let him. "So, this child is real." "Yes," she said, "and it is the first of its kind." A long silence passed between them. And then Cole said simply, "We protect it. Whatever it takes." Valari's eyes shimmered. "Even if we have to run across 1,000 worlds?" He nodded. "Then we run." She leaned into him, massive frame curled gently around his smaller one. Together they looked into the dark, not with fear, but with purpose. A new pulse began between them, not of escape, but of something entirely different. The hidden tunnels beneath the whispering chasm twisted like veins under the planet's surface. Bioluminescent fungi lit the path in soft green hues. Crystal outcrops resonated with each footstep like ancient chimes. Here, time moved differently, slower, quieter, as if the world itself held its breath for what was growing in the dark. Valari moved with care now. Each step was precise, not from weakness but from awareness. Something stirred within her. Something not fully Titan, not fully human. Something new. Cale Thorne stayed close, scanning ahead, protective but not intrusive. He had stopped asking questions the moment she confirmed the truth, not because he didn't want answers, but because the answers didn't matter. Only the choice did. They reached an abandoned chamber once used for ancient Titan ceremonies. The floor was circular, inlaid with faded runes that pulsed as Valari stepped onto them. The walls shimmered faintly. Even in ruin, the place recognized her. Cale lit a small fire using scraps from his survival kit. He placed a blanket on the ground and gestured for her to rest. She did, reluctantly. "You said your kind don't reproduce easily," he said. Valari nodded, lying on her side, her form casting long shadows across the chamber. "We do not. Our resonance is inherited, not ignited. The spark has to choose to awaken." She placed a hand over her abdomen. "This one did." Cale sat beside her. "And it's stable?" She turned to face him. "It's strong, chaotic, curious, like you." He smiled. "Then it's going to be a handful." A beat passed. The fire crackled. Then Cale asked the question that had been pressing at the edge of his mind for hours. "Do you regret it?" Valari was silent. Then she said, "No." "Not for a moment. But I fear for it. This child will not belong anywhere." Cale shook his head. "Then we build a place where it does." Her gaze lingered on him, gentle and fierce. "You would raise a half-Titan child on a human world?" "I'd raise our child wherever you feel safe," he replied. "And if no world is safe, we make one." Valari closed her eyes, a rare expression of surrender on her face. "You speak like a Titan." Cale laughed. "You make it contagious." She reached for his hand. "Then hear this. When Titans bond, truly bond, it is not temporary. It is carved into memory, into soul. We do not undo it." He gripped her fingers. "Then don't undo it." For a moment, the entire chamber brightened. The runes pulsed. The crystal walls shimmered like starlight. And in that moment, a ripple moved across Valari's skin. Energy fluttering beneath it like a heartbeat forming in another dimension. The child stirred. Outside, storm fronts gathered over Nexus 9. The command center burned with angry light. Ships moved. Orders were given. But none of them knew what they were truly hunting anymore. Not a fugitive, not a Titan, but a future. The storm had arrived. Lightning, born not from clouds but from ionized crystal vapor, cracked across the skies of Nexus 9, painting the domes and towers of the Highport in ultraviolet flashes. Wind howled through the canyons below, carrying the sound of engines, orders, and fear. Inside the upper orbital launch terminal, alarms screamed. Armed guards formed lines. Dropships hovered just above the launch pads, waiting for orders. And somewhere beneath it all, a Titan walked among shadows. Valari did not hide. She could have. She knew how to cloak her resonance, how to slip between spaces unseen, but not tonight. Tonight, she needed to be seen. She stepped onto the tarmac, 8 meters tall, glowing tattoos alive with flame-like motion, hair streaming behind her like silver fire. The air around her pulsed with heat and energy, bending light, rattling metal. and every rifle turned toward her. Above, in the control tower, Cale Thorne moved through the corridors with speed and precision. The override codes burned in his mind. He passed stunned officers who recognized him too late. His destination: Hangar Bay Theta 9. There, waiting in darkness, was an old but mighty vessel, St. Elmo's Fire, a heavy-class exploration ship built decades ago, designed for off-grid interstellar travel. Large enough to hold a Titan, small enough to be fast. He reached the console, 3 layers of lockdown. He started typing. Outside, soldiers hesitated. Valari raised her arms, not to attack, but to challenge. "You caged me," she said, voice echoing through every intercom and sensor. "You called me monster, but the monster never raised a hand." A cannon fired. She stepped forward through the blast. It struck, but did not stop her. The ground cracked. She slammed her palms down, and a pulse of resonance flattened the front row of mechs like toys. Not shattered, not dead, just deactivated. "I will not hurt you," she called, "but I will no longer run." The sky split as a gunship descended, black, silent, armed with plasma arc turrets. It opened fire, and just before impact, St. Elmo's Fire roared to life. Engines howled. The hangar doors burst open, light flooding the tarmac. Coyle's voice shouted from above, "Now!" Valari turned and ran, not away but toward the light. Bullets cut the air, sirens screamed, but she didn't stop. She sprinted, steps thunderous, and leapt, soaring through the firestorm. She landed hard on the ship's ramp, metal groaning beneath her, and scrambled inside. Cale slammed the doors shut. "Engines to full," he barked. The ship lurched upward. Anti-aircraft fire lit the sky, but Valari extended her hands, channeling a pulse through the hull itself. The resonance field shimmered. Missiles diverted. Systems failed. The sky cleared. They broke atmosphere, and silence filled the cabin. Cale staggered into the main hold. Valari sat there, breathing heavily, smoke curling off her skin. "You're safe," he said. "No," she whispered. "We are safe." He stepped forward, crouched beside her, pressed his forehead to hers. The stars opened in the view window, and behind them, Nexus 9 burned. But ahead, there was nothing but open sky. The stars were quiet. Out in the uncharted belt of Sector Tau 5, St. Elmo's Fire drifted beneath the light of a dying red giant. The hull, once scorched and battered, now hummed with the soft energy of new beginnings. No alarms, no orders, just silence and breathing. Inside the ship, Cale Thorne moved slowly through the observation deck, carrying a blanket and a bowl of warm broth. He entered the private chamber carved from what had once been a cargo bay. It had been reforged now, refitted for someone far larger than human. Valari lay there, her massive form coiled like a galaxy resting between dimensions. Her skin glowed faintly blue, and her tattoos had calmed into a pattern of spirals and rings, protective, centered, alive. In her arms, nestled close against her, was something even more impossible. Their child. Small, luminous, with limbs of soft flesh and faint crystal. Not Titan, not human. Both. Cale set the bowl down and sat beside her, eyes locked on the infant. "He dreams in pulses," he whispered. Valari's voice was warm and low. "He dreams in 2 languages." Cale reached out. The baby's tiny hand grasped his finger, and a spark passed between them. Not light, but resonance. A hum of recognition. "I thought I understood what we were doing," Cale said. "Running, surviving, protecting each other. But now—" Valari looked up, her expression softer than he'd ever seen. "Now you understand that we were not just running. We were becoming." Outside, a distant comet passed, its tail brushing against the upper sensors. The stars blinked as if in approval. Carl stood and turned to the navigation console. We're about 4 jumps from the colony belt, the fringe worlds, places where no one asks questions. Valari rose behind him, graceful and tall. She touched his shoulder. Not just a place to hide, a place to build. He looked at her. Are you ready to stop running? She smiled. Only if we start building something they cannot erase. He extended his hand. She took it. Together, they stepped toward the control deck. A new course was set. Not back toward Earth, not toward the ruins of Titanus, but forward into unnamed stars. A trajectory meant for no species in particular. A direction made for them. Behind them, their child stirred. And for the first time, Cole and Valari weren't fleeing. They were arriving. If love gave birth to something the universe had never known, would you protect it with every breath? Share your heart in the comments, because sometimes the best endings are not escapes, they are landings.